Hello, so to start off with, I'm going to first talk about what my activity was. My activity was to create a digital storyboard, and this would be for upper elementary level, but could very easily be modified to different grade levels and subject areas. So my activity had many different standards for educators. They were designing authentic learning environments, creating innovative learning environments, teach computational and design thinking, model and nurture creativity. As far as it goes for the students, it was models and visualizations, algorithmic thinking, and decomposing problems. So my objective for this activity is to introduce students to the different computational thinking concepts, such as decomposition, pattern recognition, abstraction, and algorithmic thinking. It will also introduce students to creativity, storytelling skills, and digital literacy. The materials that were needed for this is computers with internet, a digital storyboard template, which I would provide for my students, a drawing tool, which could be Google Drawings, and a presentation tool, which you could use Google Slides. For the drawing and presentation tools, you could, however, use different programs, but since my district is Google-based, that is what I chose, the one I did. Okay, so let's go through a brief instruction of what to do for this activity. So I would first introduce the students to what exactly is computational thinking. Okay, we would talk about the definition of computational thinking as a problem-solving process that involves breakdown a problem into smaller parts, recognizing patterns, creating abstractions, and developing step-by-step solutions. Then I would have my students brainstorm. They would brainstorm about their ideas based on a short story or narrative. Their story could, however, be based on a personal experience, favorite book, favorite movie, or even a fairy tale. The next thing we would do is we would do the decomposition step. So after they know their story, we would break it down. Some of the questions that I have them considering is, what are the main events in the story? Who are the main characters? Where does the story take place? And what are the important plot points? For the pattern recognition, I would help my students identify if they even have any patterns or recurring elements in their story. Examples of that would be recurring themes, character traits, or even the plot structure. For abstraction, I would have students think about how can they simplify their story. For an example, leading my main focus on the main character and events and leaving out the minor details. Then we would talk about algorithmic thinking, and I would help my students create a step-by-step for their story. An example of that would be outlining the main plot points, identifying the sequence of events, and planning the resolution. Then they would be ready to create their digital storyboard. I would provide each student with a storyboard template, instruct them to use the storyboard to visually show their story with important scenes, characters, and dialogue. Then they would present. After they finish their storyboard, I would have them present their stories to the class using a presentation tool. We would use Google Slides, and having them explain what their thought process was and how they use computational thinking strategies. And lastly, I would have them reflect. I would have them reflect on their storyboard. How did breaking the story into smaller parts help? Did you notice any patterns in your story? If so, what were they? How did you simplify your story? Were there any challenges that occurred when creating the storyboard? If so, what were they? So that is a little brief explanation of what my activity was. So now let's talk about the effective practices that we have read about in this module. So I have modeling. So in order to incorporate modeling into my storyboard, I would begin by modeling the process of creating a storyboard step by step for my students. Then I would demonstrate how to brainstorm story ideas, identify key elements, and organize them into scenes. To wrap the modeling stage up, I would show examples of the completed storyboards so that way they have a visualization of what is expected from them with their storyboards. Now, integrating. I would provide guided practice sessions where students work collaboratively with teacher support. Then I would offer my template or the prompts that I have and scaffold them to storyboard creation process, or I could even give story starters for those that need a little bit more guidance. I would also provide structured prompts and questions to help the students think critically about their story elements and sequencing. When they have these questions, then it's going to help them develop what they need to include into their storyboard. The next is releasing responsibility gradually. So I would gradually release control as students gain confidence and competence in creating the storyboards independently. I would then provide opportunities for students to be able to work on their storyboards individually, with me being available for guidance and support as needed. The next thing we have is encouraging. So I would make sure that when I'm going around the room, I'm providing verbal praise and positive reinforcement to acknowledge the students' effort and progress. I would also celebrate the students' creativity, originality, and problem-solving skills as they work on their storyboards, as not one storyboard is going to be the exact same as another, which this is one thing that I really like, that it embraces the creativity and makes the kids really become creative, and it shows their personality. I would also make sure that I recognize students' hard work and perseverance, regardless of the outcome of their storyboards. So even though the low ones, this might be a little challenging, still give them that recognition of that you see that they are working hard. You see that they are trying. Okay, this will help them continue to motivate in their learning down the road. The next thing we have is questioning. So I would make sure that I ask open-ended questions that prompt students to think critically and express their ideas creatively. So some example questions that I would ask them is, what do you want your audience to feel or learn from your story? Looking back at your storyboard, what are you most proud of? What would you do differently next time? Have you considered revising the scene to make it a little bit clearer for your audience? And lastly, what strategies did you use to organize your storyboard? How did that help you? Those are just a few of the questions that you could ask your students. By asking your students those questions, it is making them really have to think critically in how they would respond and how they are going to express that on their storyboard. The next we have is fostering alternative problem solving. So like I just said, I would provide open-ended prompts or challenges that allow for multiple interpretations and solutions. For example, I could ask students to create a storyboard based on a given theme or concept without prescribing specific details, encouraging them to brainstorm their own ideas. Another way I could do is create a supportive environment where students feel comfortable taking risks and exploring new ideas. Even if they may not initially seem conventional or right, I could encourage them to experiment with different storytelling techniques and narrative structures. So this would have them broaden their horizon. And lastly, using computational thinking vocab across the curriculum. I would make sure that I introduce computational thinking concepts and the vocab to students through explicit instruction. So I would make sure that they understand the explanation and what it means by the algorithms, the patterns, the decomposition, the abstraction, and algorithmic thinking. Now, when I am giving this instruction, I need to make sure that I am using age-appropriate language. Because if I'm using these huge words, what good is it going to do? The kids are going to have no idea what I'm talking about. So that is one key component that you have to make sure with computational thinking, is that you make sure that the vocab words that you are using are in an age-appropriate language. We would also discuss how algorithms are sequences of steps used to solve problems or performing tasks. I would encourage them to really think of the storyline in their storyboard as a sequence of events or steps, which would be similar to an algorithm. Also, I would make sure to teach students to recognize patterns in storytelling. This could be recurring themes, character arcs, or even narrative structures. Encourage them to identify and incorporate patterns into their storyboards to create engaging and coherent narratives. So that is a brief explanation of my activity and how I could effectively integrate all 7 of those practices.